Junk food might not win any health awards, but in the harsh days of the Great Depression, it became a surprising staple as rationing reshaped the country's pantry. The food landscape was unrecognizable compared to today. Let's see how junk food carved its place in history. As you may know, even the most bare-bones ingredients were unavailable. So naturally, people managed to work around their circumstances and still whip up snacks and meals that could scratch the itch that only junk food could. So, before we jump into exploring all the different kinds of things you could find during the Great Depression, let's get into some backstory. It's important that you go into this with a realistic idea of what life during the Depression looked like. First, starting in 1929, following Black Tuesday, also known as the stock market crash of 1929, the Depression saw banking systems collapse. The global economy spiraled downwards into uncertainty and unemployment on a vast scale. It was a time marked by inflation and a completely frugal standard of living, far different than anything people had previously seen before. It also meant that these people had no idea what they were in for, and the bulk of the masses took a good few years to simply adapt to their new lifestyle. People's savings went down the drain, and many started migrating to big urban hubs to find jobs or just some kind of safety net. In a time like this, there was no money, and prices were only soaring higher. It meant that even the most bare bones of ingredients like baking powder, eggs, butter, milk, and bacon were unavailable. That sounds like a pretty typical American breakfast, right? Yet that's exactly the kind of thing that if you served someone during the Depression, they'd think it was a miracle. Instead, people used non-perishable items that could last a long time. Suddenly, the focus was on ingredients built for survival and extended use. People weren't buying what tasted good anymore, or what made the best pancake. They were going straight for something that meant they wouldn't have to spend money again for the next 2 weeks, and they wanted it as cheap as they could get. Canned food became incredibly popular during this time, and it was arguably the most sought-after item at a grocery store. Canned Spam, vegetables, pineapples, and tomatoes were regularly things that people would act like vultures over. There was also big support coming from the government for canned food. Recipes would come out in community cookbooks that relied more or less exclusively on the use of it. It made sense too, since it was much easier to keep canned food than it was to refrigerate. People also became pretty adept at how they used it and what they could make with it. The biggest benefit of canned food was that it would let you have access to ready-made ingredients. Like, a pineapple wasn't something you had to cut and prepare anymore. It was something available in rings inside a can. That might not seem like a lot, but people really wanted to spend as little time cooking as possible given how tired they usually were. Ingredients like refined sugar were also completely gone from normal people's lives, and replacements like brown sugar were chosen instead in most recipes. The equipment people were working with wasn't anything to write home about either. When things broke down, or simply got too old with daily wear and tear, no one could afford to replace them. When it's too expensive to repair your oven, and when half your kitchen tools don't work, what do? People started to go for recipes that needed very little equipment to make. Soups, stews, broths, and slow cooking-based recipes were favored because they could be made in a simple pot. In other instances, people would go for breakfasts that could be made in one pan, like stir-fried vegetables. There was a big focus on utility and ease of preparation. People didn't want recipes that were hard to make. They wanted things that could be made quickly and with as little as possible. It wasn't just about the ingredients. There's only so much money you can save by shopping for groceries in a more clever way. People also didn't want to rack up a lot of wear and tear on their equipment because that meant more costs. In this time period, people came into a mindset of efficiency. Every use of something was either a cost or it was building up to be one, and that was the last thing anyone needed on their already full plate. In a time like this, it was hard to buy from street sellers and vendors because people just didn't have the money to spare. But sometimes, it was smarter too. If it was the last of your funds and it meant serving a meal to your starving family now or buying groceries that wouldn't even last, sometimes it was the smarter choice to simply go for the street food. Even those people were working with less than ideal ingredients, so the food wasn't that out of people's reach. Most would sell things like chitlins. This is pretty much the crux of what made up junk food, as people from the Depression knew it. The street food of the Depression era looked like peanuts and roasted chestnuts, tamales, pickles, barbecued meat, and sometimes, if you were lucky enough to catch them before they sold out, hot dogs. It was a time when the food cart was much more of a social hub than the bar, and you'd always find large groups of people circling around these places hoping to get the freshest and best. Each state and coast had a different idea of what street food looked like. Cornbread and barbecue were a lot more popular in the South, and Mexican-American cuisine was more popular on the West Coast. Most of these were for a few nickels, and they kept people going when they didn't even have the energy, funds, or resources to cook anymore. Still, this is just a general overview of what you might see on a stall down the street. What about the hits of the Depression? The most recognizable junk foods from a period like this, where people were coming up with new recipes every day? There's certainly a lot more than just hot dogs and tacos, so let's get into some of the most iconic junk foods from one of the worst stretches of history ever. So we've gone over the general circumstances you can expect during the Depression. In the face of empty pantries and dust-filled cabinets, how did people function? What food did they come up with? Well, with a bit of creativity, a lot of compromise, and some out-of-the-box thinking, you can still work some wonders in the kitchen. So, during the Depression, one kind of stew that really made the rounds and was a mainstay in people's homes was Hoover stew. This pretty much symbolized the resourcefulness of the era and how people would manage to scrape by no matter what. Did you know that unemployment reached around 25% of the entire workforce just by 1933? It meant that a lot of families were surviving off of literally nothing. It was in times like that when people came up with Hoover stew. One of the best things about recipes from that time period is that they were built to make ingredients last. Hoover stew itself consisted of macaroni and the really cheap kind. Next, you had your canned corn, tomatoes, and canned green beans. For a bit of protein, people got the cheapest hot dog sausages they could manage to find. Lastly, some basic seasonings like chili powder and seasonings. You'll notice that a lot of Depression-era recipes tend to use vegetables as a filler ingredient so that the protein reserves last longer. If most of the meals consisted largely of meat, then nobody would be eating chicken for too long. Hoover stew was made in soup kitchens. Most of the time, these places would be run by charities or community groups that wanted to cook for entire neighborhoods and see that their area was taken care of. That worked with the nature of Hoover stew too, since this was by default a recipe you make for a large group. It was really easy to make it in batches, and for a long time, lots of communities would pass around bowls of stew on winter nights to feel better. Also, Hoover stew became a sign of public frustration as well. The name comes from President Hoover, whose government and policies were pretty much very suspect by this point in time. People would usually serve Hoover stew at relief centers to either the impoverished and homeless or to struggling neighborhoods. It didn't have any flair, it didn't look the best, and it certainly wasn't the best stew you could get, but it was still worth making. For a long while, it kept everybody well fed. Plus, when the government did eventually switch to Roosevelt's administration, his New Deal food relief programs relied on recipes like Hoover stew a lot to keep hunger under control. The peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwich was definitely a bit out there. It was pretty unconventional. I mean, really, peanut butter and mayonnaise together isn't something anyone would really picture. It was something people made for how affordable and simple it was. It was really tough to get the right amount of calories during the Depression. That pretty much meant that most people were starving and low on energy. So meals like these, which took care of that by being calorically dense, were a godsend, more or less. Especially in a time when it was already so hard to keep food on the table. It helped that mayonnaise and peanut butter were such inexpensive ingredients to begin with, and both of those became something that families would hunt after in marts and stores so that they could stock up on it. Bread was also pretty easy to come by still, thankfully. As a result, most people simply chose to have this easy and convenient breakfast rather than anything too over the top. It was also the school lunch of the decade, arguably. I can't tell you how many families chose to have peanut butter and mayo sandwiches for their child's school lunch. In any other era, this would be the kind of food experiment you'd cook up with your friends when you were all bored or drunk at 3 a.m., but during the Depression, it was yet another sign of how creative people were. It became a sign of the times, and people who lived through the Depression often fondly looked back on the sandwich. I guess you could say that's an acquired taste. Did you know that even having this toasted was a sign that a household was doing better than others? Really. Toasting your bread meant that you had a functioning toaster and could spare the electricity. That's the kind of climate people were living in their daily life. Next on this list, we're going to take a long and hard look at depression cake. I know those are two things you never associate with each other, but this isn't half as depressing as its name makes it out to be. Depression cake, also sometimes known as war cake, was an eggless and dairy-free variant of the regular chocolate cake that people had become so fond of throughout their many birthdays. It was first popularized during the Depression as a way to deal with the low stocks of egg, flour, milk, butter, and eggs. All the basic ingredients you would need that make up a cake were now things that people were fighting each other over, or stores were just never keeping due to them being expensive in bulk. It meant that for a long time, sweet treats and desserts were off the menu for a lot of people. Birthdays were spent without cakes, and important celebrations wouldn't have anything sweet to, well, celebrate with. That's why this recipe was so dear to people at the time and why it continues to be a reminder of how innovative people can be under stress. During the Depression, it was extremely common for people to ration their eggs and butter if they had any. Spending it all on a cake may as well have amounted to blasphemy. While this cake is known as war cake too, the actual recipe of war cake goes back to World War I, and that too had its roots in a national shortage of eggs, butter, and sugar. This depression cake, however, was spread throughout the country not by government-mandated pamphlets and cookbooks, but through word of mouth. Church groups and neighbors would share the recipe with each other, and that really goes to show how people were working together. It was smarter that way. The cake itself consisted of all-purpose flour, which was still something people could get. It used the tiniest amount of sugar, with molasses and brown sugar substituting for the rest, and cocoa powder. It was a lot cheaper to get unsweetened powder than chocolate bars, and next, baking soda and vinegar helped prepare the leavening, which took care of the need for eggs. Instead of butter, vegetable oil was used, and that helped the cake retain its moisture. Finally, in the place of milk, people used water. For just a bit more flavor, people would add warm spices like cinnamon or nutmeg and dried fruits, but most people were happy with it as is. This was a recipe that really stood the test of time, and a lot more, and it is one of the hallmarks of the Depression era. It was a way for people to still enjoy a cake, which was something people had grown very much used to living without. Yet not all food from the Depression is this romantic or even something people fondly remember with nostalgia. A lot of it was stuff scraped together to make ends meet, and I'm about to show you exactly what that means. Not every neighborhood was lucky enough to get all-purpose flour. Not every house had enough money to go out and get street food and hot dogs. A lot of people had nothing to rely on, and there was no Hoover stew coming to save them. What do you think they did in times like this? I want you to share your best guesses with me because truth is a lot more gruesome than people's imaginations usually. Mock dishes, or otherwise known as mock food culture, were a massive part of what made up the daily diet of an American during the Depression. Have you ever heard of imitation cooking? You basically try to just mimic a recipe with what you have. A much more extreme version of that was mock food, and this really took the word imitation to new, undiscovered lengths in the culinary world. People were trying to mimic dishes that they were otherwise easily able to have in normal times, like casseroles and apple pies, but with ingredients that were available during the Depression. Of course, nobody had the money to make an actual apple pie, and a lot of people didn't even have the kitchen appliances to. People settled for mock dishes, which used other ingredients like molasses, crackers, and scraps to imitate the flavor and texture of classic American dishes. It was pretty much just an attempt by people to recapture some of the flavors of the times they grew up with, the happier, more stable times. Back when people had jobs and could afford to eat however nicely they wanted to. It was less about the flavor and more about the familiarity. Nobody ever thought for once that these dishes ever tasted exactly the same or even so close that you couldn't tell the difference. At all times, people realized that they were very much eating a discounted version. Still, People found a lot of solace and comfort in familiar textures and bites. Mock apple pie was made using crackers, breadcrumbs, sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice to capture the essence and taste of a typical American apple pie. Mock chicken used pork or beans that were made to resemble the texture of chicken instead of the actual poultry. Mock chicken legs were made using scraps of different kinds of ground meats that were then breaded and fried. Ground pork, especially the parts of the pig people didn't usually eat, were mixed with seasonings and baked in the form of a loaf. This was known as mock ham. A typical mock meatloaf was made using oats, mashed beans, potatoes, and breadcrumbs, whereas mock coffee was now made out of dandelion roots and roasted barley, which was otherwise just unavailable. People had mock variants of almost everything. Not all of it was even a classic mainstay dish in American culture. As you can see, some of it was just plain and daily things like a cup of coffee. Can you imagine being deprived of coffee in a time like this? It kind of makes you shudder. By the way, the recipes for a lot of these are still up. Do you think these would end up being a good test of skill? The closer you get to the intended dish, the better you must be at making things work with a limited pantry. Another grim side of the Depression is the way people used spoiled food. Like I keep emphasizing throughout the video so far, people really did not have a lot to work with. In fact, they couldn't even afford ideal storage. Refrigeration was hard to maintain on a daily basis because of how much electricity cost. Some people didn't even have refrigerators to begin with. Lots of people also chose to do their groceries in bulk. You might think, well, why buy in bulk if you can't store properly and things are expiring? And that'd be a valid question. Well, see, my dear viewer, the thing is that people had no idea what next week would look like. If you were able to buy 10 pieces of bread one day, you were buying 10 pieces. The next day, you might be able to buy 3, or those 10 wouldn't even be available anymore. Then what would you do? You'd be going home hungry because you didn't buy it when you could have. That was the kind of mentality people were living in, and that was a part of why they made up their minds to swallow even expired food. Bread that was moldy or stale was salvaged as much as possible, with people deciding to cut away the parts where mold had grown. The remaining bits of bread were used to make milk or French toast. I just told you that mock meatloaf involved breadcrumbs, right? A lot of the bread that would go stale, people would use it for breadcrumbs for mock food. Don't you think it's interesting how people stumbled onto self-sustaining systems that were this efficient? Other dishes that used stale bread were things like bread pudding or croutons. It was basically a time when people were using every single bit of whatever they had. Sour milk wasn't wasted either. People realized that the milk could still be used to make pancakes, and they used that instead of buttermilk. Meat was actually one of the biggest examples of how people left nothing to waste. Every part of an animal was used, from the nose to the tail. It simply isn't allowed to waste anything, and if kids did, then they were scolded for it. Meat that was getting close to being spoiled was instead seasoned to the maximum and cooked very, very thoroughly so that it would be safe. After all, there was no sense in eating spoiled food if it meant you'd get sick and end up having to waste money on medicine and doctor's visits. People used pig lard, bacon drippings, grease, and a lot more too. Wilted vegetables were treated the same as bread, with people cutting off any parts that wouldn't work and using them for fillings or incorporating them into different kinds of casseroles. Overripe fruits made jellies and jams and cobblers whenever people had enough. It was in this way that people stretched their pantries as much as they possibly could. Despite this, the Depression wasn't all just horrible stories of people doing their best to survive. It was in times like these where even the simplest joy or sweet treat made a world of difference in people's moods and happiness for the day, and that's what we're going to explore next. What people ate to keep them happy. The Depression was one of the most brutal times in all of American history, which is why it's so important to remember the ways people resisted and kept their composure. These sweet treats might seem small in hindsight, but back then, they were the difference between you having the last straw and you managing to keep going on until tomorrow. Honey and molasses were arguably more valuable than diamonds themselves during the Depression. They were the perfect sweeteners and became extremely affordable and accessible. They were at least significantly easier to get than refined sugar was. This made them go-tos for so many households during the Depression. It was the fact that they were naturally a sweetener that made them so multi-purpose. People really wanted to hoard ingredients like that, the ones they could use in several different ways, not just stuff that was good for one recipe only. Honey was pretty much locally produced, and lots of families kept populations of bees specifically for this reason. Molasses, on the other hand, was something that came as a side effect of making sugar. They were available everywhere, in large quantities. And to be honest, even the government would make an effort to spread these out as much as they could. That was simply how much use people were getting out of molasses, and they were invaluable, even more than sugar was. You could incorporate them into pretty much anything, even savory dishes and beverages. The next thing we're going to go over is beverages anyway, and I'll show you the different ways in which people used molasses. Getting back to our main topic though, molasses also had a lot of nutritional value, and honey did as well. This was a time when you really needed to stockpile anything that was good for nutrition. Molasses was used in brown bread, rye bread, and even for biscuits, doughs, cakes, and different kinds of cookies. Gingerbread used molasses, and pie fillings were also using them. A lot of these would also involve honey to make them sweeter and add a bit of a natural element to them. Plus, it felt good to at least have one familiar thing. People were using discounted versions of so much of what they were used to. For example, using brown sugar instead of white sugar and scraps of meat instead of good, lean cuts. It felt good that honey, at least, was left as people would remember it. Molasses was particularly a thing in the South, and that was also thanks to the region's extensive experience with sugarcane production. But they also had recipes that made really good use of molasses. Stuff like molasses pecan pie and sorghum syrup cakes, for example, were the trendiest recipes during the Depression. In other rural areas throughout the country, it was a lot more common for places to have beehives, and as a result, honey was very widely available. Fried dough delights were a pretty good treat during the Depression. See, normal pastry dough and crusts were getting very out of reach for most people, so alternatives often looked like these deep-fried pastries that we're about to go into. Some of them used to be sold by street vendors, but most were often made at home. The treats became something Americans passionately indulged in, and that's how they found their place in the culture as well. The cultural roots of fried dough are pretty much rooted in their daily use, at least if you speak about the culture in relevance to the Depression. Their roots do go deeper than that, though, since it's been a thing in America since at least the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 1920s, fairs and festivals that would happen would often have fried pastry or dough delights for sale, and most street vendors would often sell them too. While the fairs and festivals definitely stopped, street vendors never failed to see the business opportunity in fried dough delights. Push carts, especially in urban areas where people still had a bit of money to spare, became one of the most common sights to see in a city. That was how people satisfied their sweet tooth. And I'll admit, it's one part of daily American life that didn't get hit lethally hard by the Depression. A bag of popcorn during the Depression cost as little as 5 cents. That meant that for around 20, you could be getting a family bucket worth of popcorn. This was an accessible and easy treat for all kinds of people, and that's a big part of why it was such a beloved snack throughout the Depression. It rose to be one of the highlights of the era because it was one of the few comforts that stayed untouched by the economic circumstances that were drowning everyone. While popcorn's never overstayed its welcome and always been a big part of American culture, its place as a Depression-era snack is special. This truly was one of the best things you could buy back then. Plain and buttered popcorn was pretty much the everyday norm for people during the Depression, and it was a really good snack that Americans indulged in frequently. More than that, it showed people's resilience too. Popcorn was something that people treated as a side effect of hanging out with your friends. You'd go to the movies, and by the law of, well, normalcy, you'd just end up getting popcorn. To make that into a dish that would be sustenance and still bring a smile to everyone's face showcased the spirit of the American people who were determined to outlast the Depression, as hard and tiring as that was. While there weren't any movie theaters to go to, since that was a luxury people couldn't afford anymore, people did find all kinds of new love and appreciation for popcorn. What goes best with popcorn is a drink, and that goes for our list too. Plus, I did say that the next thing we'd talk about would be beverages. What do you think people drank during the Depression? I'll give you 3 solid guesses. Then I'll give you 3 items that really showcase the kind of drinks people preferred back then. You might be surprised to hear about this, but naturally, Jack Daniels and a bottle of Grand Marnier Hennessy weren't exactly something people were able to get either. Instead, they had moonshine and bathtub gin, which were pretty creative ways of getting your fix of alcohol. Moonshine itself is an umbrella term that refers to any alcoholic beverage that's been distilled in a way Uncle Sam wouldn't approve of. And by that I mean illegally. It's made in homemade stills and was often made in secret so that the police wouldn't catch on to it. Moonshine used to be made extremely regularly during the Prohibition, and its history goes as far back as the time when cowboys were still around in great numbers. During the Depression, not only was moonshine typically a way to take the edge off, but it also became a way to make some quick money on the side. People would set up illegal distilleries and start producing their shine, and since there were many people who turned to substances to cope with the stress of the times, business was booming, to say the least. Moonshine itself was easy enough to make. At least the costs were realistic to cover. It involved corn, sugar, and fruit, and then there was the distilling. None of this was healthy, though, since the distilling process was never up to standard. Most of the stills were homemade, so you can't expect much. Bathtub gin, on the other hand, was homemade gin that was made in pretty much the same conditions and sometimes in a bathtub. You'd mix juniper berries and other flavoring agents to get the taste, but these were mostly just things people started to spread around during the Prohibition, which saw some more use in the Depression. Homemade sodas, on the other hand, were a practical way for people to get some refreshments, and they weren't too bad either. Most families could still afford soda, but for the same 5 cents you could get a bag of popcorn, and that was something that a couple of people could eat together instead of a bottle that only one person could enjoy. People started to improvise with making homemade sodas instead. They used baking soda and flavoring agents like vanilla or ginger extract and molasses, yeast, and carbonated water. The mix worked well enough. I mean, you could at least make a serviceable glass of root beer. It helped to make the food better and sort of round it off as a whole meal instead of scraps. Anything that would make going through the day easier was welcome then, really. Besides that, people had their ginger ale and orange sodas, and many people also got into fermentation as a way to make homemade sodas. One thing about the Depression is that people really came out the other end with a lot more new skills than they used to have. Goo Goo clusters paint a picture of sweet marshmallows with maybe some chocolate or caramel, right? That image is almost spot on because this is a heavenly mix of peanuts, marshmallow, nougat, and caramel all drenched in chocolate. Addictive and mouth-wateringly irresistible, any Tennessee Thanksgiving or Christmas would not be complete without a plate of these for the kids. Chili con queso and a fresh basket of crisp tortilla chips at a local authentic Tex-Mex restaurant was the perfect evening snack in the 1970s for Texans. Summer enjoyment may have peaked with this and a DVD of A Race with the Devil. Little room was left for any other dips, at least for tortilla chips, because queso was just in a league of its own, especially for university students. The trend of everyone wanting astronaut food began back in the 1960s. Space food sticks made this dream come true for all space enthusiasts. Rings a bell? These sticks were marketed as a dense source of nutrients for explorers, or kids who refused to eat vegetables but were basically glorified fruit leather with a sci-fi twist. The big question: did they actually taste like astronaut food? Who knows, I haven't been to space yet, but they were definitely an interesting conversation starter at lunchtime. Space food sticks were the precursor to that whole space-age food fad. They promised a taste of the unknown and profited off the dreams of young space lovers who wanted a taste of the ocean of emptiness. The reality was probably less exciting, though, as it was simply a concentrated dose of fruit puree compressed into a stick. But hey, at least they looked cool in your lunchbox, right? And it took pretend play to a whole other level. Creamed chipped beef on toast, however, was a more happening kind of toast-based breakfast. Particularly fancy and skillful home cooks would smoke the meat sometimes to add a better BBQ flavor. Thin slices of beef in glass jars were all you needed, which were not too expensive. and the rest of the dish was completed with a creamy, thick white sauce. Meat lovers would use cayenne pepper, remembering days where they could spray it on their steaks instead of their toast. Comfort food was really lacking in the Depression times because most could not make theirs. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a wonderful replacement that we are still sad to see fade away to history. Depending on where you were, the dish was more rare because you would most often see it in middle to upper middle class households. Beef really was expensive back then, but nowadays lots of other beef-based breakfasts took its spot. Stepping away from the fryer and looking more into the drier side of food, trail mixes were a Californian favorite, and they were just a mix of different dry fruits. Almonds, raisins, dates, and pecan or pumpkin seeds you could customize to your heart's desire. Easy to see why something with so much potential for personalization became so popular in a decade all about experimentation. Yeah, it was a more grown-up version of the classic candy bar, with a slightly subtler sweetness that appealed to a wider range of taste buds. Now, it didn't have the marketing pizzazz as some of its competitors, but the Summit bar's taste spoke for itself. They tried to keep it from becoming a historical artifact. In 1983, Mars upgraded the bar to individual foil wrapping and promoted the bar as having 30% more chocolate. The new bar was longer and thinner, but wasn't as good as the original and received mediocre reviews. The Summit bar was going down and nothing could save it. Today, it's simply a fragment of our memories. Boston Baked Beans candy, just like crab chips, specializes in being easy to consume and make in bulk. Originally starting out in Massachusetts as peanuts that were coated in candy, which gave them a sweet crunch, they got popular enough to get packaged variants. Grocery stores would be filled with two things: kids and frustrated parents trying to haggle with them for one packet less in the 70s. Oatmeal cakes are a warm, fuzzy childhood dish that many might associate with visits to their grandparents. Failing economy on one side and grandma spoiling her favorite niece and nephew on the other. You just know they will always find a way, and lucky enough for us that the people of the times did it so craftily. In 35 minutes, you had a wondrous dessert to yourself that was quick enough to make after long, panic-filled days. Canned oatmeal on a soft cake glazed with an almond or peanut topping really set hearts on fire. Despite the cake's popularity back then, especially in the fitness and health community, it still did not stand the test of the time. Of course, it is a great way to spice up your oatmeal, regardless of how other breakfasts prepared with more culinary liberties taken would eventually replace it. Maple syrup has been used as a topping for pies, pancakes, and just about every kind of dessert out there, so maple syrup candy is no surprise, especially in Vermont. Vermont, you see, has a very dense market for maple syrup. It is packed with people just waiting to add that flavor to anything they are having. Maple syrup candy was something kids just could not quit, and something parents really had to control because of how easy starting a habit was. African American restaurants made peanut soup a very popular staple of Virginia for many reasons. Affordability and versatility were both something it was great at. You could add just about any kind of dry fruit or ingredients to the soup to make it better. Grandmas would affectionately make bowls for their nieces and nephews on weekends. Joints in Virginia still have it as an appetizer along with bread and rice. Now this one might be a mystery to some of you younger Gen Zers, but back in the day, bar none was the OG combo bar. We're talking a layer of crispy cocoa wafers, followed by a creamy chocolate filling, and then topped off with a sprinkle of peanuts. Think of it as a Snickers bar's slightly less famous cousin. Introduced by Hershey's, this bar had it all. Bar none made its way to our snack roaster in the late 1980s, but its reign was short-lived. Unfortunately, it was discontinued in the 1990s, and its fans are still hoping for a comeback. If you're one of the few who were fortunate enough to taste it, I'm sure you get the hype. Well, word on the street says you can find it in some secret stashes at Mexican candy stores, so if you're ever feeling like having a bar none, you know where to go. Remember those magical mornings when breakfast meant a chocolate-covered bar? Carnation breakfast bars were the ultimate cheat code. Packed with grains of dubious nutritional value and a generous dose of sugar, they were basically a candy bar in disguise. But hey, at least they had some milk chocolate, right? These breakfast bars were a marketing marvel. All anyone wanted back in the day was a grab-and-go breakfast bar that kids enjoyed and didn't give parents the trip of feeding them a candy bar as the first meal of their day. Let's face the fact that it wasn't as healthy as its advertisements. The questionable grains likely offered minimal nutritional value, and the sugar content could send a kid's energy levels on a roller coaster ride. That's probably why they faded away into the sunset. Buckeyes in concept are not too different from mountain oysters because they are just peanut butter fudge balls that have been dipped in chocolate. Taste-wise, though, you can put them on the opposite end of the spectrum. Regardless, Ohio has a deep-seated fondness for these. Giving you just the right hit of peanut butter along with chocolate, which no one has ever complained about as far as dippings go, it is not hard to see why this was so popular. Squirrel stew is also called Brunswick stew, which might be a more familiar name since it is very well known in the South. Squirrel stew typically has much more positive associations than the ones it is tied to in the Great Depression era. In some areas that were struck exceptionally badly, it was hard to get any kind of meat. Stews had already been made with tomatoes, onions, and other basic vegetables that were available, but they were missing protein. Using squirrel in stews began to be widely incorporated into the daily meals of families following the onset of the Depression. The poor neighborhoods relied on variations of this stew that worked with what they had for regular nutrition. You have to consider that these were families used to eating meat before the brunt of the era hit America, and so squirrel meat was a welcome change. You have heard of caramel popcorn with regular salted popcorn, but Chicago mixed popcorn, which you can find anywhere in Illinois, takes it up a notch. Cheddar cheese and caramel popcorn mixed together made for some loud theaters because people could not stop munching. Maybe just a bit too savory, those kinds of flavors did do well in the 1970s. Okay, now this one really deserves a standing ovation for the audacity. A round caramel, peanut, and chocolate candy named after baseball legend Reggie Jackson? Talk about a power move. Did it actually improve your batting average? Probably not, but it sure did taste good. Reggie bars were the prime example of the power of celebrity endorsement. Imagine a giant milk chocolate peanut butter cup filled with a chewy caramel center. That's basically what you got with a Reggie bar. This became the favorite snack of all young athletes, or wannabe athletes. While the effectiveness of the candy in boosting athletic performance remains questionable, its deliciousness is not up for debate. God, I miss it. Doodads. This snack mix was a classic party favor, filled with a delightful or terrifying, depending on your taste buds, medley of peanuts, pretzels, and rice and wheat squares. It was like a choose-your-own-adventure for your daily snacking pleasures. Plus, the name alone was just begging to be said in a funny voice. No one's watching, you can say it. Doodads offered a little bit of something for everyone. The salty crunch of pretzels, the creamy texture of peanuts, and the sweetness of the rice and wheat squares created flavors and textures that were both satisfying and unpredictable. Whether you preferred a salty or sweet bite, Doodads had you covered. It was the perfect snack for sharing or hoarding for yourself. No judgment here. If you liked Chex Mix, you would have loved Doodads. They were pretty much the same thing, only better. Borrowing a bit from Norwegian cuisine, lefse is a traditional flatbread that has riced potatoes, which Americans would typically eat as a wrap if in a hurry or enjoy it slowly. Versatile and full of potential for experimenting, this dish made it to home chef kitchens a lot, especially in Minnesota, where people were always showing off their new idea of a lefse. Marathon bar. This long, braided caramel bar covered in chocolate was a marathon for your taste buds, not your athletic performance. You know it was the kind of bar you shared with your friend, or at least tried to, because it was so darn big. Bonus points if you could eat the whole thing without getting chocolate all over your face. The Marathon bar was a classic that stood the test of time for over 70 years. Its unique braided caramel center offered a chewy and satisfying texture, while the rich chocolate coating delivered the perfect sweetness. The legendary size of the bar made it perfect for attempting a solo chocolate conquest. Yeah, when your chocolate cravings are at an all-time high on a typical Tuesday night. But you know what they say? All good things come to an end. And so did the Marathon bar. They just don't make candy bars like the Marathon anymore. Runza bites are another addition in the trend of bite-sized food, which is a smaller, more portable, and affordable version of the original Runza sandwich. Nebraska locals have a long-standing love for the sandwich, so bites for when they cannot handle a full one makes sense. Savory bites and the perfect blend of meat, dressing with bread made for a great lunch that kids can fondly remember. Depression cake has a name that catches your eye, but it also suits the type of dish it was. Sugar, butter, and eggs were getting much harder to obtain, and even milk would not remain an easily buyable item. This cake was thus made with a recipe that had to use none of that, which actually made it realistic enough to be applicable. Following the 1929 crash of the market, all of the normal cake ingredients soared in prices. Bakeries quickly created an alternative recipe and aptly named it Depression cake. The recipe used baking powder, water, and butter, instead of the other ingredients typically necessary for any basic cake that people are used to eating today. This was a cake that set a precedent in that era because it would inspire things like the mock apple pie. The trend of mock food is almost completely gone nowadays, but for families that wanted to still have cake, this came close enough. Another one for the mini munchy sublist on our top 20 so far is cherry hand pies, which Michigan locals just could not get enough of. Beautifully soft, portable, and filled with tart inside. These made for the perfect baked goodie to show off to your friends or enjoy on your own. People had different takes on the dish, which goes to show how frequently it was made in homes back then. Utah has some pretty questionable fusion food choices, and green jello with carrots is just the tip of that iceberg. Luckily, the tip is where we are stopping for now, and no, there is no saving grace because it is exactly what it sounds like. Diced carrots dipped in lime jello gave some sort of flavor and sensory satisfaction to people in Utah. But for the life of us, we cannot figure it out. Maybe if you have ever had it, you can share the secret behind the hype below? Back in the 1990s, the Nestle Alpine White Bars were all the buzz in the snack world. This white chocolate bar offered a smooth and creamy texture compared to the typical milk chocolate, and the almonds added a delightful crunch. For some of you, it might have been your first foray into the world of white chocolate before Hershey's Cookies and Cream made its way to your secret snack stash. It felt like a more grown-up candy bar, perfect for those who wanted to graduate from the sugary sweetness of milk chocolate into something that strikes the perfect balance of sweet and healthy. Now, I know it may not have been the most adventurous candy out there, but its subtle sweetness made it a fan favorite. This one was taken off the shelf because of its low shelf life. So if you ever come across one by chance, don't eat it. Unless you want food poisoning, of course. You might question, what is the difference between soft pretzels here and the ones in New York? Pennsylvania really likes to add a generous serving of mustard, and theirs are pretty much size XL pretzels. Now, this combo might be new to a lot of you, however, and while the ones you might find in New York crack apart easily, these are rather chewy, so kids loved them. Keebler's Magic Middles was like a childhood magic trick for your taste buds. They seemed pretty normal at first glance, but you know what they say? Never judge a book by its cover. Yeah, hidden inside a classic shortbread cookie was a creamy filling that came in a variety of flavors like chocolate, peanut butter, and even cherry. I might have just drooled at the name of that cherry filling. Each bite was truly a surprise, which turned the snack into a good guessing game. Whether it was the classic chocolate or the adventurous cherry, there was a Magic Middles flavor for everyone. These bad boys were banished from the snack aisle, but they will never be forgotten. You might be able to sue crab chips for false advertising, because on one hand they do taste delicious, but on the other they do not have any crab in them. Maryland Old Bay seasoning, which is commonly associated with crab dishes, is what these potato chips are covered in. Whatever it is, it works, and it works too good, because these things were mouth-watering, crunchy, and just the right amount of tangy. Remember when Chex cereal wasn't just for boring breakfasts? Almond Cluster Chex took everyone's favorite square cereal and coated it in a sweet, sticky glaze with generous chunks of almonds. Who doesn't love a sweet treat? It was basically a party in a bowl, and a far cry from the sad, soggy bowl of milk most of us were forced to eat as kids. Almond Cluster Chex was a game changer for breakfast cereal. The good old Chex squares transformed them into the sweet treat of our dreams, and I couldn't have asked for more. The sticky glaze added a touch of sugary sweetness, while the almond chunks offered a delightful, nutty crunch. It was a breakfast cereal, but tasted more like a dessert. And isn't that what everyone wanted? I'd still go for some almond cluster checks every day if they didn't become folklore. Maybe we have had enough fast food and extra desserts, taking a dip into the healthy side of things. We have fried okra in restaurants in Oklahoma, which is actually one of the only vegetables in Oklahoma's official meal. All right, frying it might not exactly be the healthiest kind of thing, but as far as soul food culture and cuisines go, this takes the cake. Many communities that loved soul food would always have a fried okra plate in the fridge. As the name suggests, Giggle cookies were the source of all our happiness back in the day. These sandwich cookies were more than just a treat. They were a social statement. Each cookie featured smiley faces with different expressions, and the filling came in dual flavors like chocolate and vanilla or strawberry and cream. They were like tiny edible emojis before emojis were even a thing. The Gen Zers would have loved this one, don't you think? Giggles cookies were a fun and playful take on the classic sandwich cookie. Who doesn't want their cookies to have a smile on them before they enter the dark journey of the digestive system? Plus, sharing this cookie was the way to say pickup lines back in the day. Whether you were feeling happy, silly, or mischievous, there was a Giggles cookie smile to match. Continuing the trend of mini-sized food, on this list breaded tenderloin sliders were these tiny bite-sized pork sandwiches that you could have at events or parties. Tenderloin sandwiches already did so well in Indiana, and it was an adored 2 p.m. lunch for young adults. In terms of accessibility, this made an already loved sandwich much easier to eat. Remember when Keebler Tato skins used to be the talk of the town? These potato skin chips offered a savory alternative to the typical sweet treats, and I can't name a single person who wasn't all about them. They came in a variety of flavors like sour cream and onion, barbecue, and even nacho cheese. Don't be shy, you can tell us if these were your first introduction to the concept of potato skins as a snack. Keebler Tato Skins was a surprisingly sophisticated snack for a kid-oriented brand, so the adults were never shy to grab a bag or two for themselves at the grocery store. Over time, they disappeared, leaving us with just the memory of their tasty crunch. This one will surely be missed dearly. This is one for the barbecue lovers who just need something on a skewer because chislic fits that definition to a T. Usually, you will find mutton or lamb on the skewer, but even beefsteak is used, and this dish is most popular in the neighborhoods and restaurant avenues of South Dakota. March 2018 saw it becoming the official food of the state. Definitely a great choice for Saturday night out with your friends. Triple Threat Bar. This Mars bar was a true triple threat in the world of candy. Featuring layers of nougat, caramel, and chocolate, this was the best combo of all you can need in one out there. It was like a party in your mouth, and everyone was invited. The Triple Treat Bar was a classic candy bar that stood strong for over 80 years. The combination of chewy nougat, gooey caramel, and rich chocolate was a winning formula. They almost fooled us into thinking we'd always have the Triple Threat Bar as a snack option. Sadly, this treat didn't last, and it's now a rare find that goes around for an arm and a leg. Triple Threat Bars are long gone, but Mars has launched a new range of Triple Treat of low-calorie classic chocolate bar variations. Nope, nowhere close to the OG Triple Threat. Cobbler had already been popular enough in Atlanta, so it would be natural that, like key lime, peach cobbler bites would become a thing too. Definitely popular in African American communities, as these were an affordable and easy way to have something nice at cookouts. Kids may not have particularly liked them, but adults in their 30s went head over heels for the bites. Shrimp cocktail would be sensational cooked shrimp that you would often find served with a tomato juice cocktail and cilantro, some garlic and other basic herbs made for a very savory and tangy dish that added that perfect balance of low-key flavors, which made it a popular choice for 30-somethings on vacation in Nevada. Bonkers fruit chews used to come with more than we bargained for. These chewy fruit candies with a juicy center were a textural delight. The outer layer offered a satisfying chew, while the juicy center burst with a fruity flavor. And the flavor selection was phenomenal. Introduced in the 1980s by Nabisco, Bonkers were widely marketed through memorable television commercials featuring people being humorously bonked on the head by giant fruits. They came in a variety of flavors like strawberry, cherry, and grape, making them the perfect sweet and tangy pick-me-up. Bonkers Fruit Chews always keep your taste buds guessing. They were perfect for popping in your mouth one at a time or savoring the slow release of flavor, and you could never have too many of them. Bonkers Fruit Chews are just proof that even the most tempting candy eventually gets eaten by the family dog of time. Huckleberry jam gets its love in Montana due to a regional privilege people there enjoy, which is the best huckleberries anywhere in the USA. Laying the groundwork for some incredibly amazing jam, Montana residents take full advantage with a spread that goes on literally anything you can think of. Toast, sandwiches, and crepes, huckleberry jam adds the perfect X factor to anything you put it on. Corned beef hash was another famous dish similar to the ones we have been talking about on this list. Food analysts all over the world associate corned beef hash with Great Depression cuisine as it was a way to get out of the patterns of mock foods and instead be a cheap and unique dish. Unfortunately, the meal was not that great or beloved, though it provided necessary vegetables and protein, so it gained popularity. Thick gravy in a cheap, widely available can suddenly became the go-to food for many households. When you think of beef, keep in mind that this meant anything from what was on hand, whether that was a fresh can of beef or leftovers from the last soup you had. Corned beef hash was also on the menus of diners around the states where you could get beef hash for as low as 75 cents, though those restaurant prices are in the distant past. New Jersey is known for its love of fried and street food, and while disco fries strike a more bombastic image in the mind, these are just fries with gravy, cheese, and sauce. However, sometimes that really is all you need with a side of fried chicken or a burger. Popular at baseball games or night outs on the town for people of all ages, they were a 70s classic. Now, Hostess Choco Bliss is like a warm hug from the past. This chocolate cake with chocolate filling and icing was a chocoholic's dream come true. This snack was the perfect dessert for all your special occasions, or just a regular Tuesday, we're not judging. Choco Bliss hit the market in early 1986, quickly becoming a bestseller by 1988 due to its indulgent layers of devil's food cake, chocolate creme, and icing. The moist chocolate cake was layered with a rich and creamy chocolate filling, and the entire masterpiece was coated in a thick layer of chocolate icing. It was a dessert that didn't mess around, pure, unadulterated chocolate bliss in every bite. It wasn't the healthiest option out there, but its chocolatey goodness made it hard to resist. Maybe it's time to dust off those old cookbooks and see if we can recreate this one. Hoover stew was one of those dishes that anyone could afford to make, so it is no wonder that the stew was a common item in the Great Depression. Hoover stew had two signature traits. It could feed the whole family, and you could have the dish without exceeding the monthly budget. As for the recipe, the dish involved using scraps and leftovers to increase savings and recycling in a time when households could not afford a lot. You did not need many spices, and you could easily use leftover meats. In an America where banks were going bankrupt and the job market was hopeless, the stew was a welcome addition. Obviously, it would be a popular choice among many households, as our older viewers might still remember. Fortunately, as economic stability came back, Hoover stew went away from tables in favor of more flavorful and varied stews. Donuts and America are such a classic pairing that it is a no-brainer why Louisiana loves its beignets. Deep-fried donuts that would be caked in cinnamon or other lovely toppings, it was the donut of every sweet lover's eye. Also, maybe the bane of doctors who were sick of dealing with metabolism issues. Kids definitely were very pro-beignets and would devour these up anytime they found them. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. If you love peanut butter, you would have loved peanut butter boppers because it was the elite peanut butter snack back in the day. These crunchy granola bars were coated in a thick layer of peanut butter, making them the ultimate finger-licking good snack. They were perfect for dipping in milk, because you know what they say, everything is better dipped in milk. Plus, yelling the name in your best Al Pacino voice was one hell of a party trick. Peanut butter boppers were a convenient and irresistible snack that combined two of the best breakfast snacks you can imagine: peanut butter and granola. They were perfect for on-the-go snacking or as a satisfying after-school treat. And who didn't want to bop on some peanut butter? Unless you know you're allergic to the nutty goodness. Summit bars were all about layers upon layers of deliciousness. I mean, just imagine crispy wafers and a generous helping of peanuts all smothered in a rich chocolate coating, straight out of our dreams. These bars were labeled as cookie bars on the packaging, but candy bars in some advertising. It was pretty much a Snickers bar's cooler, older cousin. If you're from Colorado and a baseball fan, you might remember Rocky Mountain oysters, which are a lot more questionable than they sound. Essentially, these are the testicles of bulls, which have been skinned, coated in flour and batter, and deep fried. As an appetizer, they were common at baseball games in the state, but it was a relatively local favorite that did not see much love in other places even in the 70s. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Clam cake dominates the New England cuisine in the Rhode Island culinary scene, and many adults fondly gobble these dough balls up. Summers would not be complete at Rhode Island without a serving of this at any party or sunbathing session, along with some chowder to go with it. People who would go on ferry rides to enjoy the summer breeze would always have these with some wine. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them, however, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Then came the cornmeal mush, joining pies and stews on the list of economically sensible lunches. When times are tough, porridges become a very enticing meal, as affording bacon strips or other meats for breakfast was out of the question. Even if you got cheap beef jerky, you did not know if it was good and clean meat, and typical American breakfasts like grilled bacon and eggs were losing popularity due to price constraints. People needed their 7 a.m. nutrition, so cornmeal mush, an incredibly healthy dish, became popular. Topping the cornmeal with maple syrup, or in some cases a thick sausage gravy, elevated it in the taste department. It was not much of a fan favorite though, because the mush did not last long after the economy settled. Once people could afford better, they definitely went back to their regulars. The pie itself did so well in family celebrations and bakeries that people came up with key lime pie bites, which were just bite-sized variants of the delicious dessert. Amazing as appetizers and amazing as snacks for sweet tooths, people would forget their civil sides around a fresh plate of these. Coffee substitutes, on the other hand, were a lot less close to the mark. Postum was the best of them, and it was usually known as a caffeine-free drink that was made out of bran, molasses, and roasted wheat. But it became popular during the Depression for two reasons. It didn't keep you up like coffee did, and it was a lot cheaper. Well, then, what was the point? If you're not drinking to stay up, and the taste isn't the same, then why bother? Why not just get tea? That might be what you're thinking, right? Well, people just wanted to experience familiar comforts. Really. In a time where it's pretty much not known what tomorrow would be like, anything familiar was comforting. To that end, people even used barley, rye, corn, and bran to imitate coffee beans. These grain-based drinks helped people keep their head on straight and helped them get through a rough day. Some people didn't want moonshine, or some people just simply couldn't risk drinking alcohol made in bathtubs. Others needed nutrition, not more soda, and others still just wanted to take the edge off because they missed being able to have a cup of coffee. These things never really got close enough that you could say, "Hey, this is a pretty good cup of joe," but they did the job well enough. And during then, that was all you could ask for. As you can probably tell by now, Depression-era cooking was nothing if not creative and thoroughly out of the box. People found all sorts of new ways to satisfy their cravings and preferences, and honestly, it's a bit inspiring. The Depression showed people how much they could do with what was around them and how they could get the best out of everything they had in their homes. It was a time when people broke out of their comfort zones just to survive and have a decent day. And it was a time when food was their best friend, more than ever before. Would you try any of these Depression-era dishes or recreate them? Comment down below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give us a like and subscribe.